The COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine, artificial intelligence. We live in a constant state of unknown, fearing the future more than ever before. And bad actors have ways of taking advantage of those fears. Good evening. My name is Maia Mazurkiewicz, and welcome to the anatomy of disinformation. Disinformation influences us by exploiting our emotions. When we are afraid, our thinking narrows down, and our bodies trigger a freeze, fight, or flight response. In today's episode, we'll see how emotions are used in influence operations. And we'll find out how to control our responses to resist these types of attacks. Us versus them is one of the most commonly used tactics in disinformation. Whether it's migrants or the LGBT community, they are often portrayed as outsiders or even an enemy that we, as a society, should be afraid of. Our first guest, Joanna Rohozinska, joins us to tell us more about these tactics.
Joanna Rohozinska, Regional Director for Europe and Eurasia, IREX, expert in civil society programs and information warfare in the post-communist space, member of the expert advisory group for the Carnegie Endowment Partnership for Countering Influence Operations project, former resident program director for Europe at the International Republican Institute.
Joanna, welcome, and thank you for joining us. You've been working in disinformation for quite some time now, even before it became a core issue in politics and media. Why have you done that?
At the time, I was working for an American organization in the US, and this was probably in the early 2010s. And there was much surprise and much kind of quandary that Russia had been starting some kind of disinformation efforts in its immediate neighborhood, as it were, right? Even starting before, because with Georgia in 2008, and even kind of if you want to go back to the Orange Revolution, but because I always worked in this geographic region and because I always worked somehow on the peripheries of Russia, it seemed so obvious and natural to me that it was more surprising to me that from a policy point of view, people didn't know what to do with it, right? And so I think it was only really after the Maidan, and then it accelerated a little bit in that there suddenly became an increased awareness, I think, in the West that perhaps it's a problem, but there was still utter confusion as to how to look at it. And from my perspective, it was largely because they didn't seem to be listening to what people on the ground were talking about on one hand, and on the other hand, they didn't understand what information operations looked like from a political point of view in kind of the post-Soviet space. So for me, it was a natural transition and an effort to, help explain the situation a little bit.
So even though disinformation is not a new concept, right? I mean, like, we have it with Romans, with the Roman
as old
Empire
as the world,
and
yeah?
all over the world. Still, when Russia really started to deploy it with the social media and to the large extent, right, nobody really knew what to do and what it is.
I think that there was it wasn't that the tactics were new, and it wasn't that the idea or the concept of information manipulation was new. It was that it was very aptly used through new mechanisms that were now available to us, right? I mean, social media did not exist before. Before, the streams of information were quite narrow because you had television, you had press, you had what you would call classical traditional media. And that whole field opened wide open in the past 20 years, I think. And so that's what the lack of preparation for it was. And at the same time, in terms of the degree of social cohesion and trust in authority, also you can see was going down at the same time. So it kind of opened the field that, ironically, more information didn't make people more resilient, right, or better informed. So I think that that's where the mismatch was.
And that was very much based on the use of emotions, right? And Russians, but also other bad actors, are using the fear and other emotions in order to kind of change the attitudes, in order to influence people, in order exactly what you've seen.
So I always quote a colleague of mine who I think always said it best, is that Russia didn't create the problem, they just pour salt on the wound, right? And so none of these issues are negligible. It's not that they don't exist. There's in all disinformation streams, in all narratives, somehow the base is an inherent fear of a threat of quality of life, for example, right? Whether there are economic issues at base, right? But also in terms of the world around us is changing and there's a degree of confusion. If you want to go back in history, there's always that. I mean, mob violence, witch hunts, and all the rest of it tended to be caused by similar things. But here we have kind of a longer period and a slower burn, if you want, probably because the institutions themselves have been stronger over the past hundreds of years, right? And particularly the post-war order in Europe and the United States has been quite, or North America, I should say, has been quite stable up until relatively recently, if we want to look at it. And it's the challenges to that that I think have largely been not unmet, but neglected to a degree. So I think that the danger with putting everything on disinformation and foreign malign influence is that it's not taking seriously the issues that do exist in these societies that do have to be addressed, but that are much more difficult to address on a domestic level.
Definitely, and they're being exploited, right? Because
absolutely.
We are right now living in the constant state of unknown. We don't know what's going to happen, right? Just like 2.5 years ago in Poland, we woke up with the war across our border that have not happened since years, Second World War, basically. And of course, there was previous invasion of Russia into the Ukraine, but not to this large extent that we really showed what is happening. And Russia was and is still present in Poland and other countries, right, to destabilize and polarize the society with bringing this fear.
Well, so disinformation in general, right, it is always based on some kind of fear at the core of it. And ultimately, the narratives, no matter what the topic is, right, whether it's migration, whether it's whatever else, the goal of it is to break down social cohesion, right? Because when society doesn't act together, it tends to be weaker. And that's the kind of complicated part of it as well, right, is that there's a very individualistic approach to it, and it's the fear that ultimately ends up undermining the institutions. So, I mean, one of the trends that you see most broadly, and there was a really good study that was done across 12 countries, both in the EU and in the neighborhood of the EU, tracking narratives around various domestic elections, and then, of course, the European elections this year. And the specific topics varied from LGBTQ issues, as you said, from migration. The war on Ukraine, of course, is another one. But at core, all of them had an element of undermining faith in the elections as well, right? And so what that implies, you know, I'm not going to talk about the U.S. so much because that was, I think, the most obvious firework case of not believing in election results, but it's a theme that
we've seen it in the Capitol, for example,
of
right?
course, we saw it in the Capitol, and unfortunately something that's not going away anywhere, but you can see it, whether it's, for example, there's elections in Georgia coming up at the end of October, and one of the main narratives is looking about, they're introducing a new electronic ballot system, right? Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? Is it going to steal your vote? Or is it not? Which is something you did see ahead of the Polish elections as well, right?
Yeah, the European ones.
Exactly, right? But so, I mean, once you start doubting the veracity of the electoral system, which means that you undermine what the results could be, it kind of starts throwing doubt on any government that comes in and in terms of the policy. So there's a chain reaction to it that's actually quite dangerous, but it usually starts from one small thing.
And if we are having such huge geopolitical changes that we are having right now, it's basically a war, right? Because like you don't need to have the army in the foreign soul, but it's enough that you really have it in the people's mind, right?
Of course you do, because if you don't have a degree of consensus in society that you're doing something together, right, it means that it's much more difficult to do. And whether it's introducing a simple domestic policy or if you're looking at something quite large, like engagement in a foreign war, you need to have a degree of social cohesion in order to do that together, right? And the fragmentation, frankly, doesn't do anybody good. Right?
Yeah, it's like also the old ways of ruling, right? Rule by
divide
division.
And conquer, exactly. So we go back to, it's as old as the world, frankly, right? So it's just the methods and the tools, on one hand, are faster and much more deeper, right? So it's also, if you start looking at studies, there's also one done in terms of what people look to when they look at media, right? And at this point, television, while still large, ends up being relatively significantly smaller, because I think the highest is in Poland, and that's at 52%, right? In all of the other countries, social media far outweighs it. And so what the sources of information are, it's not that they're dubious, but they're certainly very varied, right? And it's certainly not a uniform message that people are getting.
So what can we do actually to change that, or to counter disinformation, or to protect ourselves as well?
Well, if I had the answer to that,
$1 billion, right? Easily.
Yeah, I would no longer be working, I don't think. I mean, the difficulty is that, as they say, it's a whole of society approach, right? And so, one of the basic things is that you do have to somehow rebuild faith in institutions, and you do have to work on social cohesion, which again is difficult because it's at this point going to be a very slow process in terms of reknitting some of these things, right? And it is acknowledging what the pain points are in any given society and actually implementing policies to help fix them in some way, right? If you want to look at immigration or migration, the interesting thing is that if you're looking at what you call the new member states, right? So if you want like Central and Eastern Europe, so the relatively newer members of the European Union, they don't have tremendous experience in it, right? This has not been a place where traditionally migrants go. But if they're looking at the perceived failures of immigration and immigration policy in the West, then that's what they're taking their cue from, basically, right? Without understanding the details of it.
Thank you so much for coming and sharing your experience, and also putting up so many things to do. I hope that a lot of people are watching us and we can make a change.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure, and good luck with this important endeavor.
Thank you. Now, let's take a deeper look at the tactics and strategies used to manipulate the public. We'll learn how fear plays a key role in different efforts.
This morning, the Chernobyl nuclear site in Ukraine is now under the control of Russian troops.
Is now in the hands
Steve Lurie, tonight we're actually learning from the White House new information that staffers at the decommissioned Chernobyl nuclear site are being held hostage by invading Russian soldiers.
What we understand as disinformation is a set of complete tactics, techniques, and procedures that are supposed to manipulate the public opinion, the public infosphere. It's supposed to manipulate our opinion in order to gain some political gain, in order to gain some financial gain, and to misinform, disinform, to manipulate the public into believing something that is not real. It can take a physical form of a so-called useful idiot that can transfer a lot of falsified narratives, but it can come in a way of traditional media, of paper media, of digital media. So there's a variety of measures that we like to call an iceberg. Sometimes we only see the tip of the iceberg, but unfortunately, Kremlin in particular, they like to use a set of tactics that lay underneath what we see, underneath the ocean, one of which is hack and release operation. Russia is trying to tap into deep-seated fears and deep-seated emotions regardless of what sort of narratives or tactics they're using. They will use a set of ridiculous narratives claiming that Ukrainian refugees are, for example, more privileged than they really are. And they do it in order to tap into the deep-seated fears that we already have about, for example, rising cost of living. And through a set of different narratives and tactics, they will only try to amplify that already existing fear. They will tap into that cognitive bias that we already have, or cognitive fear, and they will try to amplify it by any means possible. So I do believe that both of our societies, both Ukrainian society and Polish society, is rather resilient, but it doesn't mean that Russians are not trying to disperse their disinformation against us.
Miles away, a tremendous roar of the explosion accompanies the motion picture camera. They filmed more amazing scenes of this colossal eruption on the waters of the Russia made by man.
It can always influence our decision-making into, for example, a health risk. When Russia taps into our deep-seated fears against nuclear warfare or potential nuclear damages, then our society that's very cognizant of what happened during the Chernobyl disaster immediately connects those narratives together and goes into that deep-seated fear and those emotional content. and unfortunately resulted to many of occasion of our citizens or citizens across Europe going to pharmacies and buying iodine products that are toxic if taken without doctor's supervision. But that was an immediate result of the amount of narratives and falsified content about an apparent imminent nuclear threat.
So far, we've looked at fear from the perspective of the experts who monitor our information space and who work to reduce the damage caused by disinformation and information overload. But how can we address fear from the psychological standpoint? We'll talk about that with our next guest, Dr. Mariusz Wirga.
Dr. Mariusz Wirga, psychiatrist, psycho-oncologist, cognitive behavioral therapist, medical director of psychosocial oncology at Memorial Care Todd Center Institute, chair of the psychiatry department at Long Beach Medical Center, co-author of the upcoming book ABC of Your Emotions.
Mariusz, thank you for joining us, straight from Long Beach, Los Angeles.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. Today we are talking about fear and emotions. We just had a great discussion on how disinformation tactics are being used to manipulate people and how emotions are being triggered in this. That's exactly the work that you are doing, also with your work, ABC of Your Emotions. So maybe if you can tell us how and why it's being used and what our brain makes with it.
It's very important. Thank you very much for bringing this subject up because indeed, effective message in anything really needs to elicit certain level of emotions and emotional engagement. Anger shows us about really expresses our values, expresses also our safety, if our boundaries are crossed. So when they, and then we can coalesce around common values that we are angry about, and then we hear the solution for it, and then, or we are really hearing a battle to fight, and very often this war semantics is very often used in order to get people to stay angry, because it's a motivating factor to go to polling stations and vote.
Is it a bit of the fight?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is it a bit of the fight in between our heart, so the values that we are having, right, the things that we are believing in, and our brain that is being triggered, right, by this fear, and is a bit building some scenarios that can happen?
Yeah, exactly. So that's very important because we don't live in the real world. We live in imagined world because we don't. Our senses don't have direct access to facts, direct access to what's happening. We always filter whatever is happening through our previous experiences, our attitudes. Thank you very much for mentioning my book, ABC of Your Emotions. The ABCD actually is the model of emotions, where A is an activating event. That is something happened, but B is already what we believe about it, what happened. Our thoughts, opinions, ideas, also prejudices. Some of them we are conscious of, and some of them we are not conscious of. And those that they are not conscious of usually work really fast. We call them attitudes. And then we have a C, which is a consequence of our thinking, and C is the emotion. And the D is what we are doing, right? The action that we take. Going to vote.
So when we are having these emotions, right, they are coming from the different perspective, right? We are going to vote, right? We are having elections. And what can be the narratives, for example, that are used and being deployed? You're right now in the US, right? So what are those fear tactics that you are seeing in there, for example?
First, so there's another messaging. So we have like two fighting parties, right? And one is really using a lot of scare and anger tactics. right? And then we have another emotion, which is joy and hope on another side, which is really looking forward, not being so much angry about the past, but looking forward what we can do in the future. And so that is very different. So we see those two things, and we will see one is going to really get to people. Because
and no matter
really,
who we are voting for, right? We are all humans. So those emotions are deeply touching us, right? Also in the times of the elections. And especially with the new technologies as well, right? We are sitting and scrolling, often without even thinking about what we see in there, right? But that's where our emotions are being triggered as well.
Oh, absolutely. So, and because everything is colored by emotion, when something is evoking opposite emotions, so the people who are wanting joy and hope are seeing messages of anger or fear, their emotions are also stirred up, and very often such messages are rejected. And so really the fight is not as much as people who are already convinced.
How we can talk with person that has different opinions that we do, and in the polarized countries, right? Because I would say both Poland and US are right now very polarized. What can we do to better understand each other?
So not only Poland is polarized, Germany is polarized, Great Britain, France, Italy, to name the few. So the way to talk to people is by engaging with, first of all, we don't need to convince everybody. We don't always need to talk about politics. So we have a lot of other subjects that we can talk about. Even the weather, which in California is usually the same every day. But when we are talking about politics, it's very important that we need to understand that majority of people on both sides strongly convinced of their, that they are. Listen, nobody maintains beliefs that they think they are right. So we always think that our thoughts are right. So here we have people, everybody thinks they are right. So that's important that we start with common values. Everybody wants safety. Everybody wants prosperity. Everyone
Perfect. So
wants jobs.
Let's look for those things that connects us, right? And keep calm. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's now sum up how fear affects our nervous system.
How do we absorb information? Under normal conditions, our brains absorb information from a variety of sources to create a balance of knowledge and a healthy emotional response. When a crisis situation arises, when we feel threatened or frustrated, it triggers a fight, flight, or freeze response. To help us, the human brain tries to limit the amount of information it takes in. It focuses on what is relevant to the crisis at hand, so it can protect us from the pain and stress of that particular situation.
Thank you for joining us. I hope that we've helped you become more aware of the emotions that social media and the information space evokes in us. Next week, we'll see how deepfakes and disinformation are being leveraged in the American presidential campaign and elsewhere. Keep calm and think deeply.